Club. Thank you so much for deciding to spend this evening with us. I'm Kathy Hadley Wilson, the programming chair for the Jack Hadley Black History Museum. As we get started, go ahead. I see someone from New Jersey. Pat from New Jersey is on the call. Go ahead and put your name and what city you are calling in from. Before I introduce you to our special guest speaker, I want to reintroduce you to our team leads. Each week, they are responsible for leading you in great and meaningful discussions. I appreciate their love for Black history and their dedication to the Jack Hadley Black History Museum Book Club. I want you to know who labors among you. First, I'd like to introduce, and please say a shout out to my husband of 37 years. His name is Eugene Wilson. Eugene is the Jack Hadley Black History Museum fundraising chair. Eugene is a retired United States Air Force Master Sergeant with a master's degree in security management. Eugene is a defense contractor for the Army in the position of cyberspace operations requirements developer. Can you say hello, sweetheart?
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all again.
Hello.
Our next
rock and roll with you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next team lead is Joy Willis. Joy is a homeschool mom and a piano teacher. Joy is a former Fulbright scholar in Argentina's love languages. Joy has taught English to immigrants and international students. Go ahead and say hello, Joy.
Hello.
Next, we have Sarah Byrne. Sarah Byrne is the Jack Hadley Black History Museum's educator. She received her Bachelor's of History from Washington and Jefferson College with a concentration in African American history. She is currently a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University. Her master's degree will be in museum studies. Go ahead and say hello, Sarah.
Hi. Hello.
All right, then we have John Steed. John Steed is a retired United States Army Command Sergeant Major. He used to be my Exceptional Family Members Program Manager at Fort Eisenhower. John is a patient representative supervisor with the Veterans Administration, and he has a master's degree in psychology.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, John. And I am Kathy Hadley Wilson. Like I said before, I'm the museum's programming chair, and I'm also the oldest child of Jack and Chris Hadley. I have my master's degree in human relations, and I work as a military family life training specialist for Magellan Federal. Now, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the author of Driving the Green Book, Alvin Hall. What an honor and a privilege it is for the Jack Hadley Black History Museum Book Club to hear from Mr. Hall tonight. Alvin Hall is the reason why we are gathering, because he took the time to research and record his findings and to preserve history. We have been richly educated on the Victor Hugo Green's Travel Guide and what life was truly like in America during the Jim Crow era. Alvin Hall is an internationally renowned financial educator, a television and radio broadcaster, a bestseller author, and a regular contributor to magazines, newspapers, and websites. Mr. Hall has published over 20 books, and we will be hearing from him as he shares with us his latest book, Driving the Green Book. We welcome you, Mr. Hall. We are excited to have you here. Our book club participants have read through chapter 5 and have listened to your 2016 BBC podcast called The Green Book. We are
Yeah.
so blessed to have you here, to be able to listen to you talk about your book, Driving the Greenbook. The floor is yours, my dear sir.
Thank you very much. I was really honored when Daniel Pittman, you will hear some noise outside probably, when Daniel Pittman asked me to give a presentation out of the blue into Thomasville, Georgia. It's a city that was a part of my childhood. When we grew up south of Tallahassee, Florida, we would often come to Thomasville, where my uncle Aubrey James lived, my grandmother's uncle, actually. So he was quite elderly when I came there. So I didn't even know about the Imperial Hotel at that time because we always stayed at one of our relatives' houses. So I was really honored to do this presentation to you all about my book, Driving the Greenbook. This book came about, as it says in the beginning, because I read an article about the Greenbook in a magazine while flying to London to do television shows. I had not heard of the Greenbook because my family in rural Florida Panhandle were too poor. All of my relatives, and we were too poor to own a car. So only one or two relatives may have owned what they called a pizza car. So when we took trips, it was always day trips. So we really had no need for the Greenbook. When I first saw it, I thought, this is so unusual. I've never heard of this, and I'm an educated Black man. So when I got back to New York City, I went to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And guess what? They have the largest number of green books of any institution in America. At that time, in 2015-16, they were still not very popular in the broader culture. And so they actually let me touch the Green Book. And so the first slides you see are some of the covers from that period of time. And are they seeing the slides? Because I can't see
Oh,
them.
not yet. Let me go ahead and pull them up. I wanted them to see you right now, but hold on. Give me just a second, everybody.
So she's pulling them up. So it was an amazing day. So I arrive at the Schomburg and they spread all the green books out in front of me on the table. And there on the table, you see some of these covers, which are coming up, which you'll see shortly. And here you have the ones from 1947, the one from 1956, and the 1960. The covers evolved over the years as Victor and his wife, Alma, decided that they would employ the latest technology. In the first couple of issues, they were very small, 16 pages, and they've been basically done in the most fundamental types of printing. But here you look in 47, they started to add photographs. In 56, they started to use more illustrations. And then by 60, which was about the heyday of this book, they were doing all sorts of different publications. This guide was created to help Black people travel on the road to avoid aggravations while they travel. Next slide, please. Now, this is what you saw in the Green Book. When you thumb through it, you would see ads for the Lenox Lounge in New York City, for the Texas Inn, and for all of these types of organizations that are businesses that were there to serve Black people because they could not get service from white-owned businesses. When I talk about this period of time and people look at these ads, young people in particular, the ad that shocks them the most is the one on the bottom left, because they cannot imagine what it was like not to be able to simply drive into a service station and buy gas. But throughout the South in particular, and in parts out West, there were many places that would not sell to Black people. If you drove into the service station, sometimes the owner, and we heard this story many times, would put out a gun and make you wait and sit there until they were ready to put gas in your car, and then they would accidentally scratch your car. But people really were optimistic when this came out. If you can hit the next thing so we can hear the sound. It's a great pleasure for me to give credit where credit is due. Many of my friends have joined me in admitting that the Negro Motorist Green Book is a credit to the Negro race. It is a book badly needed among our race since the advance of the motor age.
realizing the only way we knew where and how to reach our pleasure resorts was in a way of speaking by word of mouth until the publication of the Negro Motorist Greenbook. With our wishes for your success and your earnest efforts. Respectfully, William Smith.
This was a typical letter that you would read in the early days of the Green Book. And he brings up an important point that before the Green Book was published, this was all handed down by word of mouth. People were part of sororities, fraternities, religious organizations, school teachers, principal organizations. And when they had conventions, they would all pass down word of mouth from one to another about where you could buy gas, where you could stop, where you might be able to buy food, or what local person was renting out rooms in their houses. I put in Vernon Shaky Terry's Esso Station because, as you discovered in chapter 5, that Esso was, or chapter, yeah, I think it was chapter 5, that Esso was the first service station in America to actually carry the Green Book. And Esso did this because of the work of the Rockefeller family. They came from a very well-known abolitionist supporting family in Ohio. So they really were important in the Black community. When I was growing up as a little kid and we would be driving up to Thomasville, Georgia, the only service station that my uncle's son would even attempt to stop at was an Esso station. I had no idea why until I did this book. Next slide, please. Here is a typical sign, you might say. So I put this one up because this was actually the format for many billboards in Black communities and along highways. They did not say always it was for color. This one did, but most of them would put the owner's face up there so Black people traveling would be aware of what was going on. Also, they created GB. GB says, if you plan your trip, you'll know where you've been before you get there. And that was talking about the Green Book. But this wasn't just for the average traveler on the road. This was also for high-end travelers, as revealed by the ad in the lower right-hand corner for Oak Bluffs. Oak Bluff, along with several other well-known communities across America, including Fox Lake in Angola, Indiana, American Beach in Maryland, as well as Idlewild in Michigan. These were retreats for high net worth professional Black people, and they would go there often for the entire summer. A very good friend of mine told me the story of how his father would drive them to American Beach and leave, and they would be there all most of the summer, and his father would drive back and forth across America. So this was really interesting. I had no idea that a place like Idlewild existed in America for high achieving Black people. And this place is amazing. Della Reese would spend time there, Barbara McNair, the Four Tops, and often Black entertainers would come there to rest between shows. In fact, there was the Idlewild Review that traveled during that period of time. So I show this ad because these two ads, the one at the top was typical of the billboard, and Oak Bluffs, along with Idlewild, Fox Lake, there were about 20 of these places across America also advertised here. Sound, please.
They went on these trips because they were anxious to get back there and see the people.
Yes.
You know, and share their newfound prosperity, but also they went back to see the family.
Yes.
To go to the picnic, go to the graveyard, to put some flowers out, you know, clean off the grave. And this was like an insurance policy. You know, if nothing else, you didn't have to use it. But if you had it,
The Green
you
Book.
had the Green Book. Once they had the Green Book, they used that Green Book.
So if you had to summarize the Green Book in one sentence, its contribution to Black America first, and then the overall American landscape, what would it be?
I say traveling with dignity.
Traveling with dignity. That says what Black people were trying to do during a time when the roadway was hostile to Americans. Now, you have to think of this in a very specific way. And this is something explained to me again and again during the road trip. The risk was when you were on the road between places. You were going from one safe place, your home or your home community, to another place where your relatives existed. It was that time in between on the road that was so risky and so unnerving for African Americans during this period of time. So any tool that we could use to make those trips more safe was very, very dear to us. Next slide, please.
They went on these trips because there was.
Now, when we conceived of this first trip, so I've done 2 trips. The first one was from my past. I was born south of Tallahassee, Florida, in a county called Wakulla County. And we were going to go along the historic civil rights route, and we would end in Ferguson, Missouri. When we did this trip, we chose Ferguson because Michael Brown had recently been killed there. So we were literally going from my past into the present for this road trip. We were trying to show why this information contained in the Greenbook had resonance for people today, even those who did not know that it was important. And that was key. The second road trip, which I'll blend into this one, was one we took to do the podcast series, Driving the Greenbook, which you can download and listen to on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I took it from Detroit to New Orleans. Why did I start in Detroit? Because of something I learned at an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. They had a show called One Way Ticket, dealing with the Great Migration, during a time during which 6 million African Americans left the rural South and moved north. At the beginning of this exhibition, they had an infographic, and they showed how the populations of the cities had changed over that period of time. Detroit was amazing. In 1910, African Americans made up 1.2% of the total population of Detroit. By 1970, African Americans made up 43.6% of the total population of Detroit. It was the largest increase of any American city, driven by the automobile industry. Finally, a lot of people who worked in the South had an opportunity to give up sharecropping or an agricultural job and work in a factory up north in Detroit. Once they moved up there and settled in, they still had to come back, as the guy said in the video. So that second trip was a trip back from Detroit to New Orleans to the cities where people had moved from in the South. And those cities would have been in the Florida Panhandle, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. And those were the cities that we looked at. Sound, please.
Black person driving a car that was perceived as an affront to the Jim Crow customs, to the idea of African Americans being almost a separate caste in Southern society. So in many cases, African Americans might travel with a chauffeur's cap in the car, or even wearing a chauffeur's cap, so that it would appear as if they were driving for a white person rather than driving kind of independently or autonomously. And it's very interesting, those contradictions, because of course it was certainly okay for an African American man to serve as a chauffeur or a driver for a white family. But for a Black man to own his own car was perceived as being something that was kind of against those laws of segregation.
That was Professor Allison Cobbs from Stanford University. I interviewed her for this podcast, for this program, because she had that perspective. And we heard stories of Black men who, if they had married light-skinned women, would sit them in the back seat with their children. And if they were stopped by the police, they would say they were driving this lady home because she was the maid of the white family who they pretended they owned their car. So the rules were very, very complicated from that period of time. driving in the South. And of course, what did I do as soon as I got my hand on the Green Guide? I went to Tallahassee, Florida, where I used to go to Tallahassee once a month as a little kid to see if there were any Greenbook locations there. And lo and behold, there was the Abner, Virginia Motel. I had never heard of it my entire life. So we started there. Next slide, please. And that's what's there today. This is pretty typical. If these places survive, they are often used for Section 8 housing, or they are used as halfway housing for drug rehabilitation. You find that to be a lot of the cases in the West Coast, or they're being let decay sitting in place. So it's quite wonderful that in Thomasville, Georgia, that you all are working to restore this. So this would have been typical. This would have been a place where Duke Ellington would have stayed, Count Basie, anybody visiting Florida A&M University who did not stay in one of the homes of the professors or one of the more successful professionals in that area, usually insurance people or doctors, this is where they would stay. And it is actually an interesting place because it's really shady. You could feel the atmosphere there. You could feel the humidity in that place. Tonight, when I was at this MasterCard event and I met the lady from Tallahassee who went to Florida State University, she said, oh yes, yeah, in Tallahassee, there's Railroad Avenue. And I burst into laughter because right to the right from where I'm standing is Railroad Avenue. And that was the street that divided the Black section from the white section in Tallahassee. Railroads are always there. Next slide, please. This is just give you a sense of what it looks like when you pulled in. So you can see with all that Spanish moss hanging over the road and how cool this would have looked and how people would have found this a respite after being on the road, because at least they knew when they pulled in here, they were in a safe place. Sound, please.
It was difficult. Most times, Black families traveled safe routes, and you were very cautious.
Cautious where you stop when and how you present yourself.
You traveled during the day, you tried to get to where you were going before nightfall.
Because the least little thing could trigger violence.
Saying was, Negroes, they used the N-word then, were not supposed to be caught in those towns, after sundown.
Now, my dad would tell us we were driving up through North Mississippi. There's a little town called Duck Hill.
And we didn't go to those places.
He would always say in Duck Hill, he said, they tarred and feathered a Black man.
What we're discussing here is the phenomena of sundown towns. And many people think, and these were towns in which if you as an African-American were within the city limits after dark, you could be stopped by the police, you could be harassed, you could be put in jail, or you could be violently attacked. That's how bad it was. For me, it brought back memories of when I left college in the mid 70s and moved to South Florida. I got to Miami and discovered that Miami Beach had been a sundown town. Fort Lauderdale had been a sundown town. But interestingly, most of the sundown towns are up north: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, because many people wanted to have totally separate communities. Indiana has the largest number of sundown towns. And often those places today remain very, very hostile to Black people going into many of those areas. So sundown towns is a phenomenon that still exists. Sometimes they're sundown suburbs, and sometimes they're just sundown communities, but if you get there, you will be harassed. Next slide, please. also in Tallahassee, Florida, and this is typical of what they called a tourist home. This was owned by the Tukes family, and this did not advertise in the Greenbook, but this was a typical type of house. This entrepreneurial couple owned this house. They had extra rooms that they would rent out, and then they had this separate little room over to the side, separate little entrance where guests could come and go. And this is the way people made money. They offered hospitality to Black people who were on the road. This place has now been made it's on the National Registry of Historic Places, and the son who owns it is trying to turn it into a place that will be restored. I don't think he's having very much success based on what I've seen when I've been back there, because my relatives live very nearby. Next slide, please. This is just a sign to show you what the family looked like. I love his bow tie. And there in all of these places, many towns are trying to, like Thomasville, Georgia, save these places and get them on the National Registry. So this history of African-American life, how we survived this difficult period of Jim Crow, will not be lost. Next slide. Now, in this case, so when we drove north, we decided I would drive and see what we would find along the road. So if you look at that, I'll take off my glasses because I can't read this very well. I think we have, as the first one is, we stopped in Montgomery, and what's that? Is that Dothan? Yeah, it looks like Dothan, Alabama. So our first stop, I guess the slides are not working. So we drove from Tallahassee, and then from Tallahassee, we drove up to Montgomery. And this will be a very revealing little clip from that BBC series.
My grandfather would say to me things as a child. He said, whenever a white person comes up to you, don't look them in the eye. You always say yes, sir. You always say no. So there were these strategies that you had to adopt to stay safe. And my grandfather was a proud man. He was a smart man. But in the presence of white people, he would become this something else that was deeply painful for him, because he wants to model something for me. At the same time, he wants to keep us safe. And it's that duality, that burden, that I think few people understand.
That is Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. We interviewed him during this trip. And his statement echoed that of a friend of mine who's named Carl, who did work for the Washington Post in human resources. And he would describe how when they were driving from Detroit back to Idabena, Mississippi to visit the family's relatives, they would stop in Nashville along the way, how at every state, his father would explain to him the different Jim Crow laws. Many people think that the Jim Crow laws were the same in all states. They weren't. As you went further south, many of them became more and more restrictive, like you couldn't walk on the same sidewalk as a white person. You certainly couldn't look them in the eye, and you couldn't talk back to them in any way. I mean, these were all things that came about during this period of time. But from that interview, one thing emerges, and this emerged during my second trip, again, when we stopped in Birmingham, Alabama. Remember, he said how his father sought to protect him. When you read this book, you'll learn about the protective dance. Jim Crow laws were put in place to keep Black people in their place. And the one group of Black people who didn't understand this were children. So if you were walking down the street, many Black parents were concerned about what their children might do that might provoke anger for a white person. So I learned about and remembered that my parents did this amazing walk when we walked down the streets of Tallahassee. We'd be on North Adams Street or South Adams Street or Madison Street. And if a white person was walking toward us, my parents would distract us by pointing to a building and say, look at that steeple on that church over there, look at that different. And as they distracted us to the right, they would step to our left. So they would be between the white person and us and keep us occupied so that we would not run into the white person by accident. Or if the white person were coming on the opposite side, they'd do exactly the opposite. This protective dance was a part of the life of Black people in these small towns. And Montgomery was for us a revelation because of the proximity of Black people to white people. Remember, I just mentioned sundown towns. Sundown towns were much more a phenomena of the North than they were in the South. And that's because Black people in the South had historically lived closer together because Black people worked for white people and they didn't have cars to travel that far. So let's move to the next slide, please.
You know, my grandfather would say,
we're done now. This is what we found in Montgomery, Alabama, the Ben Moore Hotel. It is on one of the highest peaks in the city. And if you look at the top up there, you can see the what they call the skylight room, which had sweeping views over the city. This was one of the centers of Black culture. The white building on your left, 3 houses down, was where Martin Luther King lived, in a house there. If you look at this today, it's sort of shocking to see that it's still there, but it seems like everybody is just letting it fall into decay. The surrounding community has so many plaques about Black people who cook meals for the civil rights workers. One house belonged to the doctor who hid the freedom riders. He was a doctor. He had a part of his house that you could not see when you looked at it from the street. The freedom riders were bought there and they were hidden in the back of his house because the police didn't come in his house. It's amazing what you see. And these were places that were central to the Black community, the joy that we provided ourselves during segregation, the self-care that we provided, and they represent ingenuity in the Black community. Next slide, please. This is another view of the Ben Moore Hotel. And in this case, you can see that where we parked the car, there was one remaining business in the hotel, and it was a barber shop. And isn't it amazing that that one stayed there all these years? And you can see this is typical of a Black community of that period of time. Let's listen to this slide. This is one of my this little snippet. This is one of my favorite excerpts.
A regular meeting place for civil rights activists in Montgomery was listed in the Greenbook, the Ben Moore Hotel, and it is still there. It looks as if it's about 4 stories tall, a brick-built edifice planted squarely on the corner of High Street and South Jackson, occupying probably a quarter of a block. The sign is still there, Ben Moore Hotel and Majestic Cafe, but the business is long gone. And it's a little hard to imagine.
Let's move to the next one.
Bars and chains and locks that are currently on the doors. But this was once a really glamorous place.
It was nice, nicely furnished. Downstairs was the Majestic Cafe. And it had opaque, embossed windows.
Dr. Gwen Patton and Jerome Gray were both active in the civil rights movement, and both have fond memories of the hotel.
It really was a wonderful place, you know, to meet and to fellowship. And the other thing, it had the distinction for being one of the tallest buildings in Montgomery. So Ben Moore Hotel really gave you a bird's eye view of Montgomery.
They had an elevator guy. His name was Cat Wiley. And you ride the elevator all the way up to the roof. And that was called the rooftop. And you could dance and they had live music and you can buy, you know, your libations, and it was great.
Grand.
Absolutely grand.
Don't you just love her use of that word, your libations? It turns out when I was doing my research, I discovered that Ike and Tina Turner played there regularly during what they call their time on the Chitlin circuit. And there were many other people who played in that room because it attracted people from all over that part of Alabama. And this is just one of those jewels that I wish could be saved and restored. In traveling from Detroit to New Orleans, we stopped in Birmingham. And there they are restoring the A.G. Gaston Motel. It was a beautiful state-of-the-art motel in its day. Many of these, like the Lorraine Motel, were built on the Holiday Inn model. So you drive up, there was an open walkway. And in that case, the city is trying to save the A.G. Gaston. The town, the people of Memphis helped to save the Lorraine Motel. But this is the type of thing that really deserves to be saved. And I asked a young guy in Memphis whose father had been head of the local bank, what did it take to save, what would it take to save a place like this? He said community will and access to capital. And as we all know, access to capital remains problematic for most Black businesses even today. Next slide, please. You know, I had to put this in. Bring this slide. I have been on a campaign since I took this picture to get the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture to buy this room because it is a jewel of all of the barbershops that I visited during all of my lifetime, the memorabilia, the racist things that they kept, all of the images of Obama, of all the people from across history, Malcolm X. This is a jewel of a room, and only last year did they finally move away from this, and they now are in a mall. And I keep wondering what's happened to all of the items in this room. And this is where Martin Luther King got his hair cut during his days in Memphis. Click on the clip, please.
This is the last remaining business in the hotel, the Malden's Brothers Barbershop. And you walk in, and the first sign you see is colored waiting room. It's quite amazing. And then on the other wall, you have all of the pictures of his clients, people whose hair he's cut over the years.
Well, I can honestly say, like everybody would say, if the walls could talk, you know, we'll know more than what we know, you know?
Which chair was his?
The first chair right here.
First chair, and that's where he used to sit. And this is where he cut Martin Luther King's hair. And this chair right here.
This chair right here, that's right, the very one.
So he came in the shop, like most new customers. What was his name? He said, Martin Luther King. I said, where are you from? He said, Atlanta, Georgia. So after I finished cutting his hair, I gave him the mirror, said, like this haircut. And he said, pretty good. So, you know, you tell a barber pretty good, that's kind of an insult. But he came back 2 weeks later, and I was busy when another barber was vacant, but he waited on me. So I remember that sarcastic statement he had made. I said, that must have been a pretty good haircut. He said, you all right. Another sarcastic.
I love that story. I just love that story. And I think the next slide is of the actual chair. If you could click to the next slide. Yep, that's the actual chair, and that's the guy who was running the barbershop, and you can see a picture of me and the producer there. And I just think this is one of those relics of African-American history that just deserves to be saved. And I know I'm likely to fail at this campaign, but every time I get an opportunity, I say, you should go and see it. You should just take it and just install it at the museum because it's so, so important. Alabama really is a place that I've come to understand more deeply, not only because of the history of bombing when it was called Birmingham, but all of the Black codes that it created. In chapter 4, one of the challenges of a book like this is how do you write about history in a way that doesn't seem like I'm wagging a finger or just being too didactic or school teachery. So working with my editor, these 2 chapters you recently read were some of the most difficult to write because I had to talk about history, talk about the 14th and 15th Amendments and the Civil Rights Act and all of those types of things, but also give you a sense of how tight some of the rules were. And that's when I decided to use Alabama's Black codes as an example, because in that case, they had rules that regarding how high the wall had to be to separate Black people, that Black people couldn't play checkers or baseball or any games together. And they had rules regarding how white people had to be addressed. And when you read that in the chapter, it is really quite amazing. And then in addition to that, I decided to take a sign that had been in the museum and reproduce it and just the text of it, and to show you the difference of the laws in various cities. In many southern states, Black people couldn't even change jobs. So imagine if you couldn't change jobs without a white person's approval, how difficult that would be. So the Greenbook, and so a lot of people escaped this and moved up, but they still wanted to come back down. So the Greenbook became their guide to safety while on the road returning to the South. As we said earlier, most Black people left at what they call the golden hour, which was between 3 and 4 in the morning. And they did this so they could be on the road and be safe when there was daylight out. You certainly didn't want to have an accident or anything like that happen on the road, and then you'd arrive at your destination before sundown. Next slide, please. Here we are at the Equal Justice Initiative talking to Brian Stevenson. For those of you who have been there, you can see that these are the jars containing the earth from where people were lynched in were subject to terrorism. Lynching in this museum also incorporates the situation where people may have been attacked in, for example, one guy was trying to unionize the Black farmers and he was killed. So his jug is here. So basically it's a memorial to the terror killings from this period of time. If you ever have time to see this, I recommend that everybody go to see this. It is pretty powerful because you look at the different colors of dirt throughout the South. Some are clay, some are sandy, some are dark and rich. It's almost like they represent the various skin tones of Black people and everything that happened there. And here we have a wonderful quote.
A few minutes' drive from the Ben Mall, you can find an extraordinary and powerful reminder of the long campaign of violence towards African Americans. The Equal Justice Initiative offices are based in the center of Montgomery, in a building which was once a slave warehouse. The organization is dedicated to challenging racial and economic injustice, and in one of its meeting rooms, there's a memorial to all of Alabama's victims of lynching.
Wow.
Look at how many were in Selma, in
Yes.
Montgomery,
Yes.
in Greenville,
Yes.
in Bessemer.
Yeah.
When you walk into the room, there's a wall with row after row of gallon jars filled with earth. Alice Green, Martha Green, and each jar has a name on it. George, Jesse, Zeb, Buck. Some contain red clay, Solomon. Others have very dark soil, Redrick. Some of it is richly colored. Some of it very dry and sandy.
You smell that scent? That's the dirt. It's the scent of the soil.
The earth in every one of these jars was collected from the site of a lynching.
And for us, it's important that there be something visible and tangible that you can touch and feel and smell that connects you to this history of lynching and suffering.
Brian Stevenson is a lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative.
There's sweat in the soil, and it's the sweat of enslaved people. There are tears in the soil. It's the anguish of people who were menaced and threatened. There is blood in the soil, and there's the blood of the broken bodies of people who were lynched and maimed.
This is one of the most powerful things we saw during the trip, in addition to visiting the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, commonly called the Lynching Museum. The next slide contains some close-ups of those jars. If you switch to the next slide, please.
A few minutes.
And there you see the map of where lynchings were most prevalent throughout the state. It's just, you think of how much space that occupies. And that is truly one of the most horrifying things to think of. So this, in combination with the Black codes, the black clothes weren't enough to keep people in their place. They also used terrorism, and that was often the combination. So imagine if you are driving back to Alabama from Detroit or any northern state where you had migrated during the Great Migration, and now you're coming back. Imagine the fear that you would feel on the road. You knew you were going to get stopped. Gwen Patton, the lady you heard earlier, told the most amazing story to us. Her parents had moved to Detroit and they were coming back, and they were driving through Alabama. They passed, and remember, during this period of time, any white person could stop any black person. That's part of the thing that also young people find hard to imagine, but many states permitted that. So as they were driving on a 2-lane road, and they made a point of, her father said, look away, this is a sheriff coming. We don't want to get his eye attention. But her father said, as he drove past, I have a bad feeling about this. I have a bad feeling about this. And part of that bad feeling came because they had just gotten a new V8 Oldsmobile. And he knew from just his intuition that more than likely that cop would turn around and stop him. So he picked up a little speed and kept looking in the rearview mirror. And eventually he saw the cop and the lights were on, and he decided, y'all just sit here, we're gonna go. So he gunned that car as fast as he could and drove and drove and drove until he saw a black church, and he slowed down enough so that he could pull off the road without causing any dust, and drove behind the black church. And she said it was one of the scariest experiences of her life, because the sheriff went one way up the road, the other way up the road looking for them, but he never thought to look behind that black church. They waited until the sun had gone down, until it was dark, and then they proceeded cautiously on their journey, never driving above the speed limit. That is the type of thing that could happen to somebody, and you never know what it would lead to. One guy described that somebody pulled a gun on him, just stopping him on the road. So you look at this map of Alabama, and you think about the lynchings, you think about the black codes. It's pretty frightening to drive through this. Next slide, please. There are more close-ups of, I just gave you this one so you could see some of the names. I'll tell you the one thing that still probably affected me the most in seeing this was when you saw the fact that entire families were lynched. I had never thought about that. I never thought of that somebody would be so cruel to kill an entire family like that and lynch them. But the bottles showed that they did. Move along, please. So from there, we drove through to Jackson, Mississippi. But of course, we had to stop in Selma, Alabama along the way. Oh, on the second trip, I stopped in Selma to talk to Senator Hank Saunders, who was in his late 70s at that point. And he was the first Black person elected to the Alabama legislature since Reconstruction. And he told the story about how during the civil rights era, when the movement was going on, how he had a car and he had gone to a civil rights meeting, and there was a white woman there who worked with the group, and she lived 20 miles north. And the guys and the other people there, could you take her the 20 miles so that we won't have to drive 40 miles up and back, because it was in his direction? He said yes. He said it was in his instincts to take her, but it was also in his instincts not to take her. As they pulled out of town and got on the road, both sitting in the front seat, a truck pulled up behind him. He describes it as a truck, has guns on the rack. As he sped up, the car sped up. As he slowed down, the truck slowed down. This went on as he kept going, and he was getting more and more anxious. Eventually, the truck pulls up beside him, and he was waiting for a gunshot to come out and kill both of them right there. But instead, the car gunned itself ahead of them. And then that created another anxiety. Should he go on or should he turn around? Because what if they blocked the road when they got up front. And when we talked about them, I asked him, did you feel this was a form of terrorism? He said, yes, it was a form of terrorism. He said that drive to take that white woman home was one of those moments when you were scared. You know you were doing the right thing, but you were scared because you were doing the right thing, and you were scared because of the consequences of doing the right thing. So that meeting in Selma was one of the richest meetings about what it was like for him to be on the road. He also described during the summers when he and his friends would drive to New York, how they would be stopped frequently on the road and just ask all to get out of the car. That was also commonplace during that period of time. And we stopped at Selma on our way to Jackson. Now you can click the sound, please, the clip.
The road is so mythologized and romanticized in American culture.
Allison Hobbs is Associate Professor of History at Stanford University.
And the whole idea of being able to, go west and find opportunity and find adventure and explore. And that really was a difficult dream for African Americans to attain.
Get your kicks on Route 66.
The road was very unpredictable and very uncertain for African Americans.
Because the least little thing could trigger violence.
The Reverend Henry Steele, son of the civil rights campaigner C.K. Steele, and an activist in his own right.
I stopped in Butler, Georgia. I wanted to use the restroom while they were servicing the car. The guy said they were out of water.
This is a white guy who said this to you.
And there was a black guy working under the hood. And when the white guy had turned his back, he said, nothing's wrong with restrooms. They just don't want you all to use it. And so I went back to the guy and I said, are all the restrooms out? He said, yeah, they are all. I said, would you show me? Then this other person who was getting his car service intervened and walked up to me and slapped me in the face. Said,
slap you?
Yeah. We don't like your kind around here. He had a son, about 14 years old, ran to the car, got a gun, and came out and put it in my face. And I slapped him.
Reverend Steele admitted that he was lucky that day that he was not shot. In chapter 5, one of the objectives of the book is to show the parallels between the past and the present. I share with you stories about Carl Westmoreland and his father being treated badly when he went to a conference when he was a municipal officer, and Hubert Humphrey was the mayor of Minneapolis. And then many, many years later, as a grown man, when Carl goes out to San Diego to the Coronado Hotel, where he has the same experiences. One of the things I wanted to show people was the connection between the Greenbook time and events that are happening today, so they will help them understand the news better and why people react the way they do to hearing these incidents on the road. Imagine what it must have been like to be on the road before you could record anything. That has made people far more aware of the incidents that Black people often face when they're on the road. Move on to the next slide, please. Jackson, one of my favorite places to visit during both road trips. I enjoyed my time in Jackson so much. And this is what's left of a lot of the places, just blank fields. And if you can tell, this road in front is the lead road into the interstate highway system. Jackson is typical of so many places. When the interstate highway system was being routed, it was routed not through slum clearance, as most people believe, but it was routed through Black business districts. And that was because many people wanted the dollars that were being spent in those thriving Black communities to be spent in white communities. And that's just a fact. And so a lot of the places exist like Summers Hotel. This is all that remains, except the memory of one of the people who would go there with his wife. And he said she was a church woman and she would wear her shades and she would be sitting there with her eyes closed as he was bopping and beeping to the jazz. And he told about the wonderful times he had at this place. And those were the types of stories I tried to capture throughout all the book. It's not just the on the road stories with the Green Book, but it's also the stories of these communities and the people who live within them. What were their day-to-day lives like? Next slide, please. And here's a picture of the Summers Hotel in its heyday, when it had the submarine club at the basement, the subway club at the basement. You can click on the clip, please.
I got one story, this lady down in Mississippi. She had a house always ready, always clean, waiting for someone to come from the Green. They never showed. She was waiting for them. She said, I want somebody to come in that door saying they saw my address in the Greenbook, and no one ever came. She had everything laid out, you know, she had plenty of sheets, she had the best crystal, china and all that stuff. And she wanted to serve these people, but no one ever came.
I love that story because I think it talks about how even during segregation, business was not guaranteed. Yes, we had very few choices when we were on the road. Yes, we didn't know where we could buy food, or we could only buy food in a few number of places, but not all the businesses thrive. One of the magic things about driving the Green Book and doing the programs and writing the book is that you see that this book is a record of entrepreneurship within the Black community during a time when everything was very restrictive. It was about the imaginations of Black people providing the service that people wanted during that period of time. Every time now I look through the Green Books, and you can do so online since the Schomburg has now digitized all of its collection, so you can go to the New York Public Library's website and just go through them. You will be amazed about what it says about entrepreneurship during these years in the Black community. And I suspect it's the only nationwide record of this. So this book was more than just a place to learn where to get services and safe havens. It was also a record of the entrepreneurial spirit within the Black community. Next slide, please. And this is Ferris Street. Ferris Street was the street in Jackson, Mississippi. People used to pour in from around everywhere. At nights, the streets would be crowded with people. Foreign people, people who had worked as maids would come in to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to have a great time. The streets would be crowded. The next couple of slides will show you what it looks like today. Next one, please. And this is the Big Apple Inn, I think it's called, the Big Apple Hotel. This was featured on Anthony Bourdain's program about the South. This restaurant is important because in Memphis, the guy came from, I think it was Mexico. And when he saw the slaughter of the pigs, he asked the slaughterers to give him the pig ears. And he turns them into this food, which is still very popular, a pig ear sandwich. And we're going to hear from the current owner of this hotel, of this restaurant, about what the city was like back in its heyday, or what Ferris Street was like in its heyday.
Well, this street was, I guess you can call it a safe place, a safe haven for African Americans. 2 blocks east, west, north, everywhere you go, it was the white section of town where Black folks couldn't go. Everything on Ferris Street, however, was built by freed slaves. No architectural degrees, no major education. They built their own buildings, made their own businesses, their own clothing stores, their own fire department, their own restaurants, drug joints, all happened right here on Ferris Street. It was like, in fact, it was called Little Harlem. It was called Little Harlem. The train station is 2 blocks over. Yes. Folks get off the train, they come straight to Little Harlem, and the streets was packed. The streets were packed all the time.
And the term Little Harlem actually applies all across the America.
On Ferris Street. We had the Mint, the Alamo, the Booker T, and we had one on another street that was Black businesses in Jackson was on Lynch Street. So on that street there were barber shops and grocery stores and novelty shops and cafes and juke joints.
Juke joint.
Juke joint.
Where you drink and you
Yeah,
party and
and
you
you
dance and you juke. Exactly. I love that. If I forget what movie I saw recently, and they called them juke joints, and I thought, oh, the juke joints, right? The different pronunciation is just that. Another aspect of doing the series was all of the different Southern accents that I got to encounter along the way. That was pretty heartwarming to me because it really reflects the types of accents that I met when I lived with growing up in Tallahassee, Florida. So I just love Ferry Street. But in every town in America, there was a little Harlem, whether it was Jefferson Street in Nashville, Walnut Street in Louisville, the Avenue in Mobile, Alabama. These were all the centerpieces of little Harlems. And this is where people thrived and businesses grew. And these were the areas that were often targeted or isolated during the building of the interstate highway system. So even as mobility increased and Black people could travel, they were often kept away from the businesses that they had supported over all these years. Okay, next, please. Next slide. That's another one of Ferry Street. Next slide, please. And that is Ferry Street. This is the one remaining business on Ferry Street today. And this is another one of my all-time favorite clips. So when you drive down these streets, you'll find a few braiding shops, hair braiding shops today. You'll find a few barber shops, maybe a few convenience stores, but there'll be gaps in which there's nothing. But if there was a funeral home there, the funeral home generally is still there today. And funeral homes served an incredible place in African-American history when we were on the road. We're going to come to that slide because I met the guy who owned the funeral home, and he opened my eyes to a part of African-American history that I did not know. If you could click on this slide, please.
This funeral home is the oldest Black funeral home that's totally owned by Blacks in Jackson. And there's only one second oldest funeral home in the state of Mississippi that's older than that, that's owned by Blacks, and that's Jefferson and Vicksburg.
And this has been there in the same location all these years.
It started across the street, then it came from over there, moved over there. Mr. Collins is over there. You can talk to him if you want to.
Oh, yeah, that would be great to talk to him.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So here I am thinking, what do? I don't know anyone in this town. I didn't have the Greenbook, but I had been taught something by my parents about what you do when you're stranded in a place where you don't know anyone. See if there's a Black funeral home, call them and see if you can stay at the funeral home. I did that. I asked some Blacks in the street, if there's a Black funeral home there. They told me there was. So I called the funeral home, and the funeral home owner told me that I could come and stay. And I told him who I was, that I was a teacher. But that was the kind of thing that our parents taught us about how we needed to be flexible and what things we could do when we were traveling if we got in a predicament like that. And that happened to me.
If you want to sleep here, that's fine. Because I tell you what, them people back there ain't gonna bother you. That's one thing you can rest assured. If they don't bother you out there, these back here sure not gonna bother. And I've been here over 50 years and nobody's ever bothered me.
Just love that clip. I think it's so funny. The way that, no, I've been here for 50 years and nobody's ever bothered me. And he was just the most droll interview you can imagine. But he had lived it, and he was just telling the truth. And he shared stories about people who would get stranded there and had no place to live, and they would come and sleep there among the caskets in the back of the funeral home. And that was a commonplace story during that period of time. Even big singers who they were on the road, especially gospel singers, would often get to places and need to find a place to stay. And the one place they could always count on was the local funeral home. So this is one of those parts of Black culture that I did not know until I got to this particular location. Next slide, please. We have about 15 minutes to go. This is more Ferry Street. I just added this in, and you can click on this clip, please.
Where there have been barriers Blacks have found ways to get around those barriers and really have fun in a way, you know, because these places that were cited in the Green Book, those places really became wonderful places for Blacks to go to and meet, not just to travel, but it became social gathering sites like the Benbow Hotel.
And what he's talking about, not the social gathering sites, was just this network. It was also a network of people who knew about these places, who shared this information. And Victor Hugo's ingenuity was his ability to turn this into a magazine and keep it successful. In chapter 5, I talk about the competition for his environment. There were other guides out there, the Go Guides, published by various different other organizations, but somehow the Green Book survived. And I think it survived because he had marketing ideas. He would add sections on places to go, where you could have different types of holidays. He tried to set up a travel bureau. So he was always thinking more broadly than just providing people with a place to find a safe haven. So I think that was what kept him going. And if you look at that, the 50s and the 60s, when African Americans up north were buying their first cars, when the ones who worked for Ford, Chrysler, and GM were able to afford cars, that's when we were on the road and we wanted to see America more. And many of us would drive to these places just to have the experience of freedom, because we wanted the American dream that was being denied to us. And because the segregation laws wouldn't allow us to achieve that, we created a parallel world for ourselves. Next slide, please. Then we drove all the way to Memphis. Look at the number of places listed in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, like New York, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, Newark, these places had huge numbers of places for Black people to stay. And it is impressive that this place, with all of these, was just a thriving mecca for African-American life. And one of the places at the center of it that was advertised in the Green Book was the Lorraine Motel. Now we all know, next slide, please. We all know about the Lorraine Motel, but this trip was a revelation to me. I did not know the nexus about the Bailey family and their close relationship to the community there. For example, they had a restaurant at the hotel, and they would buy produce from the local distributors. They didn't get the quality that they wanted. So they went and bought a farm in Shelby County, and they set up relationships with the farmers there. And so they could buy their sources directly from the rural areas surrounding Memphis, early farm to table. That's how innovative they were in running this hotel. And this became one of the safe havens. If you could click on that clip, please.
Here we have civil rights, facts versus fiction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a new Bill of Rights for everyone, regardless of race, creed, or color.
And what's interesting in the next line, after what you just read, it says public accommodations effective at once. Every hotel, restaurant, theater, or other facility catering to the general public must do exactly that. 31 state laws already in effect have even stronger provisions. So in other words, it was the law of the land that all hotels, restaurants, theaters, other facilities had to serve African Americans.
But I can tell you that that didn't happen. Having been raised in the South, in a small Southern town, it did not happen because many things remained completely segregated. People did not change. You still couldn't stay at certain places. You still couldn't go in certain restaurants.
2 or 3 nights later, I went home. I told my wife, I said, let's go out to the Diplomat Inn and check out the Civil Rights Building. She said, okay. So we got all dressed up. We goes out to the Diplomat Inn. The Diplomat Inn was a restaurant, a cocktail lounge, and a hotel. And so we went into the cocktail lounge, ordered a round of drinks. The waitress gave us, she was pretty nice. So 5 white boys came in over to the joining table, and a little bit later on, they had a live band playing. And so one of the band members said, "Do we have anyone want to make a request? Anyone want to make a request?" And one of the white boys jumped up and said, "Play Dixie." And boy, the band cut loose on Dixie. And so it got kind of a little bit rowdy and kind of loud. They started calling Coke Coons, and we was on the Blacks in the cocktail now. So I told my wife, "I think we better leave." And so she said, "I think so." So we got up to walk out, and the band played Bye Bye Blackbird.
Isn't that amazing? Bye Bye Blackbird, right? This is just, these stories are amazing, and there's so many of them. And when you are reading the book, you're going to get far more than was in the BBC series or in the podcast series available on Apple. Because what I did, I took all of the information and chose the best of it for those things. And we move on to look at the Lorraine Motel in the next slide. It was a safe haven, but not safe enough to keep Martin Luther King alive when he stayed there. On the day that he was shot at the Lorraine Motel, Loree Bailey was on the switchboard. She was directing the calls to get the ambulances to come there. She told her colleague that she was working with that she didn't feel well. She went upstairs to the room they had on the second floor, and she had an aneurysm on the day that Martin Luther King was killed. And she died on the day of his funeral. So for the Bailey family, this has always been a fraught thing. In working on another project that I'm doing, we found pictures of Walter, his son, Dr. Champion, and Walter's brother cleaning up the remains of Martin Luther King off of the runway outside the room, because the police took their evidence and they just left everything there. After this incident occurred, the Lorraine slowly went downhill, and it was auctioned on the courthouse steps. Luckily, a group of local businessmen in Memphis were able to buy it for $144,000 at this auction on the state steps, and they were unable to turn it into the National Civil Rights Museum. But this is one of the most important places we visited, and you can look at it and see that it too was based on the Holiday Inn model from that period. Next slide, please. And this is just another showing you the room. Next slide. Another one showing you what it looks like today if you have not been. Next slide, please. And we just give you some ads to show you the types of businesses that were in Memphis. I just love this because you think of nightclubs, plaza, and remember that Memphis was also the home of Stax Records, Booker T and the MGs, Rufus Thomas, Otis Redding, right? So this was a place where all sorts of musicians stayed. And in the register at the Lorraine Motel, many of them stayed at that place. It is an astonishing archive. We can listen to this sound clip. We're almost near the end.
Every year in his introduction to the Green Book, Victor Green wrote that there will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. With the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it seemed that the Green Book would no longer be needed by Black travelers. Yet, there are many people who feel that the Green Book, or something like it, is still needed today.
This was where I felt that I had to bring us back from the past to the present. So in chapter 5, when we talk about the whole arc of the Green Book, that the 50s and 60s were his great times, we then looked at what happened to the Green Book as integration occurred, and it didn't become necessary, and the readership fell off. But the Green Book was really a microcosm of what was happening to hotels. All of the businesses listed in the Green Book were being affected by integration in a very similar way. So yes, getting equal rights in society was important. But many of these businesses who lacked access to capital, who were always just struggling, disappeared, and the communities around them gradually shrank as the money and the engine, the economic engine, where Black dollars were being spent in Black businesses gradually died off. This is one of the sad aspects of this period of time. Next slide, please.
Every year.
And from Memphis, we drove to St. Louis. So now we're in the present. And this will be about the end of it, actually. We drove to St. Louis because Michael Brown had been killed there. That was part of the journey through space and time that was very important to me, because I wanted to show how this was still relevant today. And when we got there, next slide, please. We met this wonderful lady who was a local school teacher, and she talked about something that every Black family knows about. She talks about the day that she heard about Michael Brown, and then she talks about the conversation that her father had to have. If you click on this, please.
Incidents like Michael Brown's death are leading to an extraordinary and increasingly necessary conversation between Black parents and their teenage sons. It's about staying safe in any encounter with law enforcement officers.
My brother was maybe 18 or 19. He's in his early 20s right now, so it wasn't that many years ago. But my dad was having a conversation with him about never leave the house without your ID. If you come across a police officer, just be honest about what you're doing. Show him your ID right away, even if he doesn't ask. Tell him what you're doing before you even pull it out your pocket. And I was in awe. I was like, you all have these kind of conversations all the time. So me as his Black daughter, he wasn't having that conversation with me, but he knew he had to have it with his Black son because of how things are in St. Louis.
Isn't that amazing? The talk, as we call it. They had to have the talk. I'm going to end with two stories that are really, that stay with me almost every day of my life. One involves Hezekiah Jackson, who I interviewed in Birmingham during the second trip. He described when he and his family drove up to Detroit because his Aunt Beattie had died. And it was a time to go to the funeral, to pay your respects, but also to see their cousin. And when they got there, Aunt Beattie's husband didn't have a car. So they drove to the white suburb in Detroit. And when he drove there, he said, oh, he had flowers, and he saw flowers that he'd never seen before, the types of houses. He wondered who lived there. It was like a television show, he said. And as soon as they pulled into the driveway, the police pulled up. And as his father got out of the car, they said, what are you doing with this nice car, boy? You know, do you work for some rich white people, boy? And his brother had never heard anybody talk to his father in that way. His mother was looking at the children in the rearview mirror. They were all in the back seat with her hand to her mouth subtly, right, to get them to keep quiet. And the brother said to him, do you hear that white man calling my daddy boy, calling daddy boy? When Hezekiah told me that story, I had never thought of the collateral damage to all of these incidents on the road, that the children see this and they become distrustful of law enforcement officials or people who stop them. And the tone of voice that was used was so bad. Hezekiah still tells the story with a break in his voice, because I think his brother was really affected by it. He said, we had so much respect for our father. Nobody would have called my father boy or talked to my father that way. Many years later, with his nephew, he was telling the nephew the story about this sort of thing, and the nephew thought it was some sort of fairy tale, until the nephew, not that long ago, 5 or maybe 6 years ago, was pulling onto an interstate highway, and he got stopped by the police. And they said, don't do any, he called them immediately, and they said, don't do anything until we get there. It was only then that the son realized what he told them, what the family had been warning him about, was true. So driving the Greenbook has been, for me, an incredible journey into what I thought was going to be a road trip. But at the end of the road trip, what I realized that I had gained many insights from that time in America about the communities where these businesses were located, about the people who enjoyed the services that these businesses provide, how Black people, even despite segregation, was able to create worlds for themselves where there was joy, where there was happiness, where there were so many wonderful things to experience. For me, driving the Greenbook, the podcast, the book, and the BBC program has been a journey that has enriched my life and helped me to understand current events in so many rich and wonderful ways.
Mr. Hall.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was
Thank
excellent.
you. Wow.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I see my friend Ann is there. Hello, Ann.
It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for that fabulous presentation.
By the way, Ann is my friend whose parents lived in Thomasville, Georgia.
Oh.
Yep. I spent a lot of time there growing up. And I'm so excited about the Jack Hadley Museum. I think it's an amazing contribution to Thomasville.
Alvin, I'm Jack Hadley. Thank you so much. Appreciate this. This is beautiful. Thank you. My heart is filled with joy. And we just want to let you know that Imperial Hotel is on its way back. We renewed another Imperial Hotel, but however, we still got a few question marks on it, but it's in good shape. It's in good hands. And Kathy, send him that piece I did a documentary on, and let him see what it looks like on the inside, Kathy.
Well, I'm going to come down and see the hotel on April 4th or 5th. I'm doing a documentary for the BBC World Service, and I have to stop in Atlanta, and I figure I would drive from Atlanta to Tallahassee, and so I'll be able to stop by on the way there.
Give me a call and let us know when you're in town. When you're coming up. Okay, April 4th or the 5th, you said, right? We'll put that on our Daniels, you hear that now? We'll put it on our calendar. Thank you so much. Appreciate everything that's beautiful. Thank you for your time and everything. It's just been very hard feeling.
Most welcome. Somebody else had a question.
Well, let me say this again while they're trying to figure out. Kathy, your dream has been fulfilled. You talked about this for the past few months, and so here it is to the whole world, and it's just been beautiful. Thank you, Kathy, and all the team, Daniels and all. Thank you all for making all this possible. And I've read the Greenbook, audio portion of it, and it is magnificent. It's a good. It's letting people know that we cannot forget our past.
Yes.
If we don't, we're going to repeat it, and that's my mission in the museum today. That's the reason why I'm doing what we're doing. My son Jim, he's on now. He's blind, but I got my cell phone on. Jimmy, just holler at me for 1 second, okay?
Yeah, I like to. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear him?
Yes, Daddy, we can.
Yes. This speech, or this episode, it really gets you. It's more heartfelt than just learning about lynching. Just the fact that they had to go through the things they went through is not talked about. They talked about the lynching, but it's just the things that they went through, and that was an opportunity to explain, the Greenbook, that there's more to it than getting from place to place. It's in that in between, getting from one place to another place. That in between has a lot of stories.
Yes.
Yeah, and we lived that life, Jimmy. I've gone through the Greenbook.
For me, in talking to all of these interviews, I think there are over almost 50 interviews I did, And, you know, you hear stories about people driving across the railroad tracks. The sheriff comes in, sees a gun in the car and puts it to the man's head with his nieces sitting in back. And luckily there's no things in it. He pulls the trigger and said, you'd be dead if there were bullets in this. But the thing that's remarkable across all of the interviews is how the African-American people who had these experiences were not trapped by them. They did not lose their optimism. They did not lose their sense of forward thinking, and they did not lose their sense of grace. The thing that got them from one day to the next was that inner grace and forgiveness. They were focused on the future for themselves and for their children. And that was a truth across everybody I interviewed.
I see, Rita, you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question, Rita?
Yes, thank you. I have several things rigged up here so that I can participate today. So if
Let's
you get
hold on one
feedback-
second. Can everyone mute except for Rita so we can hear her?
It may be me because I've got several things that are set up. I couldn't turn my camera on or my mic. So I kind of set it up on my phone.
Okay.
And it's maybe causing interference. But my question to you, Mr. Hall, is in your book, you talked about things that are very prevalent today.
Oh, yes.
Not a lot has changed, but that's of my opinion. Based on what you experienced in your travel, do you think that very much has changed? And if you do think that things has changed, do you think that there has been a profound impact on our youth by what they see today and what African Americans experienced in years before?
I think that what has changed is that we do have more freedom to move about. We have access to higher education at more institutions than we had before. We have openness about different types of jobs, whether it's in coding, whether it's in technology. Tonight I was with all of these people who work at MasterCard and the diversity of jobs that were there, both as entrepreneurs. So I think that part has changed because we are not restricted in the same way. The things that haven't changed substantially are the communities in which we are allowed to live, because there's still a lot of de facto segregation in America. And I think that this story I'm going to share with you about Hank Sanders really captures what has not changed. Hank Sanders participated in the Selma March, and he said Martin Luther King would say, "How long?" and the crowd would say, "Not long." Martin Luther King would say, "How long?" and the crowd would yell back, "Not long." And he did that repeatedly. And the crowd believed that with the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the subsequent acts, that segregation and all its evil effects would end, and that freedom, total freedom, and access to the American dream would be available. Hank Sanders then took in a deep breath and said, "But I underestimated the depth of white supremacy in America." I think what we see today is the morphing of that. It has not gone away. Many people, it still exists within those communities. I think also of Jan Miles, a lady I interviewed in New Orleans, who does the post-racial Greenbook. And we were looking at pictures, and she said, those pictures and those lynchings where you see all those people standing around with those lynched bodies. My grandmother was alive during that period of time, and she's still living. And if you think about it, all of those people who stood under those lynched bodies, Rita, they are still alive, and they have had children. If you think about that, you know it's just morphed. A lot of it hasn't gone away. That's why when you see today's events, sometimes I have a hard time personally sometimes I can't watch them because I hear voices from these interviews saying, I don't know how you fix this. I don't know how you get this out of people. So some things have changed. We have better opportunities. I would not be here today without that. But at a core, there's a core, some things haven't changed because people still hold on to those ideas.
Yes. Butch, I see that your hand is up. Would you like to ask your question now, please?
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation, and I pinned my question in the chat just to conserve and save time. So my question is in the chat, and I also placed there a link from South Carolina's Greenbook. They have a digitized Greenbook that has been resurrected in the last 10 years that point to African-American stories as well as new markers and sites that they can visit throughout the state. So I wanted to share that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. But I didn't see your question because I don't have my chat open. Sorry.
Rich, do you want to still ask your question because he can't see it?
Okay, so my question is then, looking at the travel, there were people that you came across that were last living witness. For example, Mary Ellen out of Titus, Ohio, Joyce Coleman out of Cincinnati. What were they reluctant to tell their stories? And as you move south, for example, Tony Dennis from Jackson, Mississippi. If they weren't reluctant, how did you build the trust in the people? Did they hear you were coming or did someone say so? But how did you build the trust to get their stories out of the people? Thank you.
Very good question. I have been doing interviews for I would say regularly since 1996 when I was discovered by the BBC and I created the first program reality show about money. And talking to people about money personally and in the front of their faces is a very hard thing to do. So I sort of perfected some of my skills during that period of time. But I'm also a Southerner by nature, and I'm good at being who I am and just being honest with people and talking to them in a way that is trustworthy. There was so often that people would stop when they met me and go, "Where are you from?" I would say, "Oh, Waukesha County, Florida." I knew you were from the South, and just like that. And that led to a conversation about where I was from, who were my people. And then we'd start the conversation and go on. I was there to share with them. I never judge. I always am fully present. And my questions come out of their questions. I don't sit there with a list of questions in front of me when I'm interviewing somebody. I talk to you the way I'm talking to you now. And that was the way I built their trust over all these interviews. And we did have some problems calling around when we were calling. I had a field assistant, field producer. Her name was Oluwakemi Aladasuhi. And it was, sometimes people didn't want to talk to us, but we booked all of our interviews before we got on the road. And then we left enough time. So if a person said to us, "Oh, you should talk to that person down the street," we did. And that's how we got to Tony Dennis. We were walking down Ferry Street and I said, "Well, I should have my shoes shined." And we started a conversation with him. And if you heard the entire recording, not only was he so funny, but he also captured what that street was like in that day. And he was totally trustworthy.
I see a hand from Eugene and then Holly.
Yes, I'm going to give you a quick little background about something, how it moved me in the book, or basically, I'll give you a little background, then I'll hit you with my question. So, sociologists have long used the term migration, when they're describing the movement of large numbers of humans from one region, space, area to another. By the same token, we have individuals who study animal behavior and their respective movement tendencies. They employ the same terminology and really within the same basic context. At times, though, I personally take exception to the use of this particular word when it comes to describing the plight of Blacks who were fleeing from a bad situation to one they hoped and dreamed would be better for themselves, their families, and ultimately their race. The reason is, for me, I guess, African Americans have long been cast as subhuman in some circles, or spoken about as downright below that of animals. In a way, this kind of strikes a chord with me because to me, it almost seems to validate this absolutely horrible notion of African Americans as inhuman. At the end of the day, we're talking about, the human condition and not an animal's travels. So, Mr. Hall, my question, while you were researching and then ultimately writing the book, did you and or your colleagues ever experience a similar conflict of intellectual thought? And if so, how did you address them and move forward with the project?
We had this problem when we were writing about the incidents regarding the Red Summer of 1919 and the Tulsa Massacre. That's when we had serious problems with the language that was used. We were aware that there was among the media, especially in the South and in parts of the middle America, that this was part of a use of language that was deliberately misleading. The Tulsa was called the Tulsa Riot. In other towns in Wilmington, Delaware, it was called something else. And so what we then did was to try to use a much more a term that reflected the truth of the situation. And those were really hard times to talk about. Also, we talked about the use of the word terror. We know this is more of a contemporary usage of the word, but I really believe it's accurate for the day-to-day traumas that Black people were subject to in the South. In terms of the word migration, I think we probably left that in because it's a commonly used word and the derivation of it isn't necessarily related to animals. But in particular, if you look at the Greek derivation of it, or the Roman derivation of it, it doesn't come solely from that. But I understand what you're saying. I do understand, and I think it is something that I will now think about in a different way. So I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So after Holly, Carmen from California, we'll go after Holly.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hall. That was a terrific talk, and I love your book and I love listening to it and reading it at the same time. My question is, you mentioned the Civil Rights Act being passed, and I'm curious to know whether you have any thoughts about whether the whites who were in the legislature at the time had any sort of maybe had any kind of like thoughts of undermining Black businesses at that time, because it seemed as though the sort of the arc of it was that the Greenbook sort of became less useful because the Black businesses mentioned within it became less viable. And so I wonder if that was something that the whites at the time who were in power sort of thought of, like kind of knew that that would happen, or, sort of like, in politics today, it seems like there's all these like kind of subplots, and so I'm wondering if you had any kind of feel about that, at the time. I mean, obviously the Civil Rights Act and, changes are fantastic, but I just wonder if there was more underlying it than I've ever thought about. I guess.
I think if you read Robert Caro's autobiography of Lyndon Baines Johnson and how Johnson got this through, you'll see that there was a lot of resistance to it. And he was able brilliantly to use his skills and knowledge to be able to get it through. Now, at the same time, when you read that, you also need to keep in mind that under Eisenhower, they had started to build the interstate highway system. And Eisenhower did something that was quite unusual. He turned the decision-making authority about the routes to the states, and the states then turned it over to the local authorities. So what more than likely happened is that it started out in, I think in Bangor, Maine. And as they went south, they got smarter about what they could get away with and how they could route it. You look at St. Louis where it's routed. I mean, it's blatant. You look at Jacksonville, Florida, it's blatant. So I think the routing and targeting of Black business arose opportunistically.
Gotcha.
I'm sure that a lot of people who did not fully support the Civil Rights Act wanted something to happen, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. And then this came along and it was just opportunistic. That's what I've always felt. I have no evidence for that except that I've read the Caro book and I've read other things. I just think opportunism in politics is there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Carmen, do you want to go ahead and come off mute?
Thank you. Mr. Hall, thank you very much for this presentation and for writing this book in the first place.
Thank you.
Just personally, it brought up certain habits that I thought were my dad just being insane, especially as a teenager when, we're leaving early in the morning and we don't stop to go to the bathroom and we packed our lunches. And I just always thought that was just dad being his quirky self, and he obviously was not, unfortunately. And I think that was it's been really interesting. And I think one of the things that I think about as we talk about, and one thing I love about your book is the parallels between the past and current situations and where we see ourselves now. And my question to you is, in terms of I'm sorry, my classroom light just went out.
That's all right. Okay.
I'm still in my classroom, sorry. One of the things that is really interesting to me is how we move forward from this, because the stereotype is that it's just terrible in the South, that it's very racist. I mean, that is my stereotype growing up here and why my grandparents left the South in the first place. However, there's a lot more, like you were stating, Indiana, here in the North and West, that we really, so how do we combat, how do we protect ourselves and yet combat some of those stereotypes? Because I think about people driving up north thinking, oh, it's safer in the North. And people like myself who want to go to Thomasville and Boston, where my family was from. And I'm so fearful because I don't want to be on the road in the South when it's not Atlanta or New Orleans.
Yeah.
So how do we go about doing this? And I think my lens might be an educational lens in particular.
Well, I think there are two potential lenses. I think I have long held that part of the reason this has persisted is housing patterns in America. I've lived in London and I've visited other places where the housing patterns aren't so rigid. And you can buy in a neighborhood. I think people are segregated because historically there was that 2019 expose in Newsday about segregation patterns on Long Island, which were fixed. I mean, the real estate agents help keep them that way. So if you don't live next to somebody, you don't get to know them that well. And that resistance to that living next to each other is really a problem. So fixing the housing patterns in America would be one lens that would help that. education, but increasingly people feel that their education is feeding them stuff that they don't want to know and don't need to know. You see this with the resistance all throughout certain states. I think more realistic dialogues in many different places would help. A friend of mine worked for the Democracy Project, and I thought those dialogues in small communities around America would help. But a lot of this is so deeply ingrained in people, as we have seen, that it's almost like they don't want it to change. They have so much invested in keeping the status quo. If I could come up with a solution, I would win the Nobel Prize in America. That's a fact, I would, because it would just be the perfect. But it's something in America that was initially, for many people, part of being an American. When a lot of that was the other part of the book that was so hard for me. I realized that all of these people who came over from Europe brought with them, in becoming an American, many of their own prejudices, and they feel they're entitled to them. America gave. That's been really hard for me. That's been so hard for me. You think you'd come to this country to open up for freedom, but a lot of people don't. So I don't think there's an easy answer in dialogue. I do believe changing housing patterns would be helpful. However, I also know that, as we have seen, breaking people's beliefs in house values and what affects them is almost impossible. They hold on to old beliefs no matter what happens. So you asked the 100 million, or should we call it the $1 billion question for the evening?
Hopefully we can answer it, and I'll share it with everyone.
Exactly. Maybe we should say 50 billion, so we sound really rich.
Thank you very much.
That's a very good question. And you've given me something to think about when I have my cocktail after this call.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, I have a couple comments about the housing situation. When we've lived in Georgia, I think 7 years now, Eugene. And when we first came to Georgia, we were leaving Oklahoma to come to Georgia, and I was scared where to find a house. And so the realtor would take us around to the different communities, and I would say, well, how many Blacks live in this community? Because I was kind of scared to go, because Carmen, what you hear, I was hearing the same thing. And I was kind of scared to go to a predominantly white community to live. And we ended up finding a community with 75% Blacks. And there was a sense of relief, because we knew that, even still today, I feel like we knew that we were in a neighborhood that we wouldn't have any kind of opposition.
Yes.
And within the past couple of years, we live about an hour and 15 minutes from Columbus, Columbia, South Carolina.
Oh, you do? Oh, you do. Wow.
And as a military soldier, assaulted a young Black guy in their neighborhood, asking him, what is he doing there? So it still happens, and I'm very aware of it. We want everyone to have unity and get along and all that, but we still have those feelings of, I hope this is a good area that we're moving into.
Yep. And that's what people felt during the Greenbook days. It's very similar. And I think that's part of the problem with America. These are issues that just linger there and are hard to remove, hard to repair, hard to correct. And we know that the government and our representatives don't have the will to do it. So who has the will? How do you get people to see things differently when it's so ingrained? When it is, in reality, for many people, an entitlement.
And then I have just one other comment that I wanted to make. When you were talking about the man and his family drive along the road, and then a car would catch up to them, and they would drive a little bit faster, and then the car
yeah.
would
Hank
drive a little bit faster. Yeah.
Sanders, yeah.
My mother, she is 87, almost 87, and she, we were asking her not too long ago, what kind of Jim Crow experience do you remember? And she told us a similar story to that. Her dad was, and this is in Thomasville, everybody, so there's a lot of people in Thomasville on the call. Her dad lived on Greenwood Plantation, and they were driving from Greenwood to town. And she said that a car full of teenage boys did that same thing to their family. And so they were first behind my mom, and then they came beside them. Then my grandfather speeded up, and then they speeded up, and then he just slowed down. And if I remember the story correctly, Daddy Jackson just kept going slow, and then they just moved on. And so that was I believe was an act of terrorism for my mother's family. And my sister asked, well, how did you feel? And she goes, well, I was with my daddy, and so I just felt safe because I was with my dad.
Yep. That's because often Black parents use their bodies as shields, and they kept their children innocent. So they did not have to know that these horrors were going on. Black parents really wanted their children to pursue the American dream, to pursue and realize their own excellence. As Hank Sanders says, my mother had a peculiar confidence in her children. And I think that many Black families had confidence looking at their children, that their children could go to school, achieve something, as everybody on this call has done, because our parents cared, our parents loved us, and they shielded us so that we would not have the seeds of hatred or resentment deeply embedded in us as young children.
Yeah. And, she doesn't remember them yelling about it or getting upset about it. It was just,
Yes.
And, she ended up, she went to an HBCU, she was a nurse, she was successful.
My battery is about to run out, so I need to I'm gonna have to go and plug in my computer quickly. Can I run away?
One quick thing for you before you go, real quick. Thank you so much. I appreciate everything that you educated with us this evening. What you talked about housing patterns, I kind of experienced that when I moved here to Aiken, South Carolina. When I initially moved here, as I drove down the road and was looking for a house, I could see rebel flags. I could see all kinds of different things going on. Really, the scare tactics to keep us away. When I moved in my particular neighborhood, I was the second Black to live in this particular neighborhood. Yeah. And now it was probably 75% white, and probably that 2% maybe Black. And now that has changed. And so I did that intentionally. There was the best schools for my family, the safest place, and I'm still here, and we're changing things. Thank you, sir.
Bravo. Thank you.
And I wanted to say this, and then
hold on. I need to plug in because hold on a minute. If I don't plug in, out.
We don't want him to leave us, do we?
We chased him off.
No, because I do have another question. I'm gonna get out of this.
Rita, how did we know you had another? I know you had another question. You probably got like 5 or 10.
Sorry, I got it right here.
Oh, because of technical difficulties, I've had to kind of be quiet over here. But now that I'm figured out how to get out of one and just be in the other.
You sound a little bit better now. There's not an echo anymore.
And
now
I'll wait until he comes back.
Okay, now I'm back.
But my question, Mr. Hall,
yes,
is about how we have shielded our children.
Oh my God, yes.
And I have been notorious. I have 2 daughters, and I most definitely shielded my children. And I told them that their battles were mine to fight whenever they were in school and having difficulties with the white teacher or a white neighbor or anything that was dealing with racial issues.
Yes.
But my question to you, even though I shielded them, and at the point of shielding them, I felt like that was my duty to do that. Have I sheltered them to the point where they don't realize that discrimination is still as vivid as it was? It's just taken on a different look and feel.
I was thinking of this very topic the other day when I was listening to something Michelle Obama had said. And I think as a parent, you have to be honest about that. You have to talk about it in a very realistic way. So your children, they don't have to experience it, but they need to be aware that this could happen to them. And it's a realistic conversation you must have. You can't send them out sort of Pollyanna and think and let it happen to them when they're 18 or 19, because then it's a really traumatic experience. But you can open the door to those conversations early on and explain what's going on in a way that they get it. And I think you have to give your children that's a survival skill. That's not being cruel. It's not being a helicopter parent. You're giving your child a survival skill. My grandmother used to say to me because I left home when I was 15 to go off to college. And my grandmother used to say, I've given you everything you need to know the difference between right and wrong, but also to know what to walk away from.
Yes.
And
we just got to keep talking. We got to tell the story and just not sugarcoat it, and just keep and make sure that we don't repeat the past. That's what we preach in the museum every day, is that be honest about it and just tell the story. Don't hide nothing from the kids. Let them know the struggle we went through. I lived through all of this, what you've gone through. We travel east to west coast and all that. So I've gone through it. When I read some of the articles in the book, I saw to get a little twitched up inside because I've experienced that. I've experienced been turned away. You black, you're black. You cannot. We don't serve black in this restaurant. So all of that, but you tell it to make sure that everybody understands it. Hopefully that this will start to do some healing for us, black and white, and make us move forward to the future. You know, it's a story that we cannot sugarcoat. We got to put it out there. Your book is just beautiful. I'm a postman just like
Victor Green.
Victor Green. I know what he was at when he was doing that. He had the connections, from city to city, and he put together that book and wasn't thinking about getting wet, but he did a great job. So, and you come back and go on and test it, but you got to test it. Come to Thomasville and see what beautiful city of roses we have here in Thomasville. Just how things have gone smooth. We have some problems, but we don't have a problem that we have to really get out there and fight about. But it's just been I'm waiting to meet you in person when you come to Thomasville.
It'll be in April. Okay. Well, thank you all for a great evening. I've enjoyed this so much. It's time for me to go and have a cocktail and eat dinner.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed this so much. Thank you.